What does this beautiful countryside chateau have to do with Louis XIV becoming the Sun King who established the absolute monarchy? And what's the connection between this chateau and King Louis's first official mistress, Louise de La Vallière? We'll find out. In our last video, we looked at the beginning of the relationship between Louis XIV and Louise de La Vallière. This was in the early 1660s. Around this time, King Louis was finally trying to personally rule France. The chief minister who managed the country during the early part of his reign, Cardinal Mazarin, died in 1661. Many people expected King Louis to select the next chief minister, just like his father did when Cardinal Richelieu died. The front-runner for the job was Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet was a highly intelligent and capable person. He belonged to the class of nobles called noblesse de robe, or the nobles of the robe. These were people who gained their rank by holding certain administrative or judicial positions, rather than the traditional nobility based on their lands. Fouquet was considered the leader among this new class of nobles. He was known for his generosity, social skills, and fashion sense. Nicolas Fouquet was indeed a capable person who earned his position. From a young age, he gained the recognition of Cardinal Richelieu, and later, of Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin entrusted him with seemingly impossible missions, such as managing the finances during the numerous wars France waged early in Louis XIV's reign. The wars with Spain and the Habsburgs, for example, severely strained the national treasury. Fouquet, with his vast network and exceptional personal credit, managed to borrow funds to support the war efforts. His financial acumen allowed France to win these wars and avoid bankruptcy during the early years of Louis XIV's rule. Fouquet also played a crucial role during the Fronde, a series of civil wars in France. He was the city administrator of Paris at the time of the Fronde Rebellion, and he mobilized all available forces to rescue Mazarin, Queen Anne, and young Louis, when the royal family was in danger of being captured by the rebels. When Mazarin and the royal family had to flee Paris during the Second Fronde, Fouquet safeguarded Mazarin's properties and returned them intact upon their return. He also placed spies to gather intelligence on the rebels, contributing significantly to the suppression of the Fronde. Some even say that Fouquet risked his life to protect Louis from being killed by rebel nobles early in the Fronde. Fouquet's contributions to maintaining and stabilizing Louis XIV's reign were undeniably significant. And by the time Cardinal Mazarin died, Fouquet held the positions of Superintendent of Finances and also the Procureur Général, or the Chief Prosecutor. These positions allowed Fouquet to yield immense power. As the Superintendent of Finances, Fouquet had control over the nation's finances, meaning all collected taxes passed through his hands. Additionally, as the Chief Prosecutor, he could prosecute or pardon individuals as he saw fit. If anyone tried to accuse him, he had the authority to dismiss the charges. Not only was he powerful, he was also a trendsetter of the time. For example, at the time, there was a rule that when the nobles of the robe entered the palace, they had to wear a black robe and a white shirt underneath. This set them apart from the traditional nobles who could wear fancier clothes. As I mentioned, Fouquet was a trendsetter and fashionable person, so he found these rules too restrictive and unfashionable. But he had to follow them nonetheless. So he wore black robe, but had his sleeves shortened, so that the sleeve cuffs of his white shirt could be seen. And he put elaborate decorations on the inside of the cuffs, so when he rolled up the sleeve, the decorations could be seen. In addition to his fashion sense, he also had an impeccable taste, and patronized prominent writers and artists. And most importantly, Fouquet was generous with his money. With lavish gifts and bribes, he built a vast network of supporters and spies. He had no shortage of people who will vouch for him, and will pass important information to him. The Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte was an example of Fouquet's impeccable taste. He first acquired the estate at around the age of 26. At the time, the chateau was just a large residence of country nobles. Fouquet invested a considerable amount of money, to transform the place into a small palace with grand gardens and an architectural design that could awe any noble. And after spending 20 years renovating and redecorating the chateau, it was finally finished in 1661, the same year Cardinal Mazarin died, and King Louis met Louise de La Vallière. Shortly after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, Fouquet hosted a grand celebration at Vaux-le-Vicomte on August 17, 1661. This event was an extravagant display of wealth and luxury, intended to showcase Fouquet's achievements and status. But Fouquet also planned the event to show his dedication and loyalty to King Louis. When Louis XIV arrived at the event, he was greeted by Fouquet. As Fouquet led the king around the chateau for the tour, Louis was struck by its opulence, which surpassed that of many royal palaces. Fouquet spared no expenses for the party either. He had the most popular theater troupe of the time, Molière's troupe, perform at the event. King Louis was greeted by actors dressed as mythological muses as he walked around the garden. Then the king was led into the chateau, and the interior was even more lavish than the garden. It was decorated with expensive tapestries, paintings, antiques, and jewels. King Louis was indeed impressed by the style and the extravagance of the chateau. Then, Louis's steps suddenly stopped in a particular room. This was a room designed specifically for the king. Fouquet had designated one room in the chateau specifically for the use of the king, such that no one else could use it. He also spared no expenses in the decoration of the room, thinking that Louis will be pleased by it. It was an expression of his loyalty to the king. Looking up, he saw a ceiling adorned with gold, featuring beautiful paintings. These paintings depicted King Louis's life, from his birth and through various achievements. To show his divine status as the Son of God, he is painted as interacting with various celestial beings. Upon entering this room and taking in the sight, Louis XIV's expression changed. This reaction was something Fouquet had not anticipated. Then, the king turned to Fouquet and said, "I am not feeling well, I need to return to the palace." Despite many planned events remaining, the king got into his carriage and headed back to Paris. No one understood what was happening. Is the king really unwell? What's going on? He seems upset. People were confused, and Fouquet was quite bewildered. But Fouquet was a master of networking, and he soon found out what the problem was. None other than Louis XIV's own mother, Anne of Austria, sent him a letter explaining the situation. The king always wants to be the richest man, and he never likes anyone wealthier than himself, because he believes they must have stole from him. Fouquet made a mistake. He thought building a lavish room for the king, with his own money, would demonstrate his loyalty to the king. But instead, it sparked intense jealousy in the king. Upon returning to Paris, Louis XIV summoned a man named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was an intendant of finances, a man who reported to Fouquet. When Cardinal Mazarin died, Colbert gained Louis's trust by telling Louis where Mazarin had hidden some of his assets. Louis asked Colbert to go over the secret plan he had prepared before. Colbert explained the plan in detail, as if he had been waiting for Louis's request. In fact, Colbert had been warning the king that Fouquet was embezzling the tax money. He was trying to persuade King Louis that sacrificing a powerful man like Fouquet could send a strong message to all the nobles. When Colbert first proposed his plan to take down Fouquet a few months back, Louis was hesitant. This was because Fouquet's power was immense, and Louis XIV had experienced firsthand how the nobles could unite against him, potentially leading to a backlash that could endanger his reign. Also, Fouquet had contributed significantly to the safety of the royal family during the Fronde, and had even saved the king's life. So it was difficult for Louis to take a drastic action against Fouquet. But after visiting the Vaux-le-Vicomte, Louis was finally convinced that Fouquet was becoming too powerful and too rich, and was ready to get rid of Fouquet. He instructed Colbert to proceed with the plan, which was to arrest Fouquet on the charge of embezzling state funds. But there was one major obstacle. Fouquet was not only the Minister of Finance, but also the chief prosecutor. So, if anyone would accuse Fouquet, he could simply tore up the indictment, and that would be the end of it. So King Louis and Colbert put their heads together. At that time, Colbert had heard a rumor that Fouquet had been spending a lot of money and needed some cash. Colbert then told Louis that, with the right price, Fouquet might be willing to sell the position of chief prosecutor. At the time, there was an established system where high-ranking positions were bought and sold. So one day, Louis summoned Fouquet. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay until the end, at your event at Vaux-le-Vicomte. I wasn't feeling well." Fouquet, who had been worried about the king's reaction, felt a bit relieved. Then Louis said, "I heard you're a bit short on money these days." Fouquet responded, "How did you know?" Louis continued, "There's someone willing to buy the position of chief prosecutor. Do you want to consider it?" Fouquet was willing to sell the position, but he didn't want to sell it to anyone who would oppose him. So he asked, "Who is it?" Louis named someone completely insignificant, someone not worth worrying about. So Fouquet said, "If the price is right, I'll consider it." Louis then asked, "How about 1,000,000 livres?" Fouquet had originally bought the chief prosecutor position for about 400,000 to 450,000 livres, so if someone was willing to buy it for 1,000,000, he would make an immediate profit. Fouquet eagerly agreed, and sold the position of the chief prosecutor. But even without the position of the chief prosecutor, Fouquet had immense influence over the nobles. So Colbert and Louis feared that an open accusation might provoke resistance from the nobles, so they decided to arrest him quietly. So the king announced a plan to convene the Estates General in Nantes. Since it involved tax collection, as the superintendent of finances, Fouquet would also have to attend. So Fouquet set off to Nantes, and was arrested right after leaving the city of Paris. This was because they were worried that Fouquet's supporters would rise up if they tried to arrest him within the city. So, with the king also outside Paris, they waited until Fouquet left the city, and then had the musketeers arrest him. The arrest was dramatic and swift, with the captain of the king's musketeers personally overseeing it. The name of the captain was D'Artagnan, as in the main character of Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers. The character was named after this Captain D'Artagnan, who was a well-known figure in France. Fouquet's trial was a lengthy and contentious affair. Louis XIV insisted on a charge of treason, but the court found it difficult to convict him. Many judges sympathized with Fouquet, leading to delays and resistance. Ultimately, Louis XIV replaced the judges who opposed him until he secured a conviction. Fouquet was sentenced to life imprisonment and spent the rest of his life in Pignerol prison. But, is it really possible that King Louis would turn against the man who saved his life, just because he had become too rich? There was another story. I mentioned Fouquet had an extensive network of people who passed information to him. When King Louis began the affair with Louise de La Vallière, one of the first people who noticed this was, of course, Fouquet. He wanted to gain favor of Louise, and, as he normally did, tried to present expensive gifts to her. Fouquet was, after all, known for giving gifts to important figures to build his network. And it worked out well for him so far. Now that he noticed Louise, Fouquet couldn't ignore her. So Fouquet prepared gift for Louise. It was a lavish piece of jewelry, even more expensive than his usual gifts to other courtiers, because, after all, Louise was becoming a very important figure who could influence the king and have access to the most valuable information. It was so valuable and splendid, Louise was hesitant about accepting it. And when Louis saw the gift, he was consumed with jealousy, thinking that Fouquet was trying to seduce Louise. And some say this misunderstanding contributed to Fouquet's downfall. After Fouquet's arrest, King Louis also arrested and imprisoned many of his friends and connections. They were accused to have embezzled state funds, and were released only after their properties were thoroughly confiscated. Many nobles were reduced to poverty as a result. Then, when the Palace of Versailles was built and court life began, they were reduced to seeking king's favors to gain some privileges or positions to make a living. This meant that anyone who previously had the power to defy the king lost that power. So what happened next to Fouquet? There were constant petitions and efforts to save Fouquet in Paris. Whenever too many people defied the king, King Louis sent someone to torture Fouquet. Then, when the report that Fouquet was dying reaches Paris, the protests and petitions would die down. He was never released from prison, and died in 1680. But what about Louise de La Vallière? Did this incident with Fouquet affect her at all? In our next video, we will continue with the story of King Louis and Louise de La Vallière. So please like and subscribe to receive the next installment of this story from history. It really helps a small channel like us